Arrays are a common feature in many programming languages. Arrays are going to be extremely useful for helping us to keep information organized. So what is an array? An array is an ordered, integer-indexed collection of objects. That's a fancy way of saying that we can take objects like strings and integers and put them into a group, and then keep their position in that group in the same order, so that we can refer to those objects by their positions. We can tell the array, give me back the first object, give me the fifth object, and so on, because the objects are going to be indexed according to what position they hold in the array. One good way to think about arrays is that they're like those expanding file folders that you can buy to put your bills in. You might put your electric bills in the first pocket, and your phone bills in the second pocket, your mortgage payments in the third pocket, and so on. You have a preset order, and you can put things in pockets and take them out again. Put this paper into the third pocket. Show me the paper that's in the fifth pocket. That's the way that arrays work. Now, there's no limits to how many pockets your array can have, at least none that you're going to need to worry about. And a pocket can contain anything that a variable can contain: a string, a number, even another array. In fact, a pocket can be just plain empty. And an array can be assigned to a variable, which makes it easy for us to reference a large collection of information by using a single, simple variable name. Let's try an example. We'll open up basic.html. We'll do save as, and let's call this arrays.php. I'll change the title to be arrays, and let's create our first PHP tags here. Now the first array that I'm going to create, I'm going to assign to the variable numbers. Now the way that you define an array is array, open parentheses, close parentheses, and that's it. We now have defined an empty array and assigned it to numbers. There's no objects inside this array, it's just empty. We can put a series of objects in our array and separate them by using commas. For example, I'll put in some numbers: 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. So now I have an array that consists of numbers, and those numbers are always going to stay in the order that I've put them there. They're going to stay in that exact order, and that way I can refer to them by position when I want to get them back out. So let's try that. Let's see how we retrieve something from an array. We'll use echo. We're going to reference the variable numbers because that's what's pointing to our array. It references it. And then we're going to use square brackets. And inside those square brackets, we're going to provide the index that we want it to return. In this case, the index will be the position. Let's return what's in position 1. Put our semicolon at the end, and let's bring that up in our browser and take a look. Go back to Firefox, and instead of floats, let's bring up arrays. So there it is. It returned an object to us, and the object that it returned was 8. Now wait a minute. If you go back and you look, 8 is what we would have expected was in the second pocket. And that brings up a very important point about arrays that we must always keep in mind. Arrays are numbered starting from 0. The first pocket is indexed as 0. The second pocket is indexed as 1. It will take some getting used to if you haven't worked with arrays before, but that's how arrays work in almost every single programming language, not just in PHP. So if we change our index to be 0, and then we go back and we reload our page, we'll get back the first item, which is 4. So the first item is indexed with 0. You really want to make sure you drill this idea into your head. The first pocket in an array, the first item in an array, the first value is always going to be referred to by using the index 0. Now, as I said, an array can contain lots of different types of objects. So for example, we can have a mixed type object. We'll call it mixed, and inside there we'll have an array. And in that array, let's put the number 6, the word fox, followed by the word dog, followed by another array. And in that array, we'll put X and Y and Z. So you see how that works? It doesn't matter what kind of objects we put in there. It can be integers, it can be strings, it can even be other arrays. Any valid type in PHP can go inside an array. So let's now echo back one of those values. Let's do echo from mixed, and let's ask it for what's in number 2. Let's put some BR tags in here just to clean this up a bit. Put one up here as well. And let's also ask it, before we go back and reload the page, for what is in pocket number 3. Now we know what number 2 should be, right? Because we know that they start counting at 0. So you can go down the numbers and say 0, 1, 2, and figure out what's going to be in the second position, the second index. Let's bring that up in our browser and take a look and see if you were right. And it returned dog to us. Now, notice here, we got a notice, array to string conversion is what's happening, and it returned to us array. So when we asked for the third item, they came back and said, it's an array. That's what I see there. I see an array. And it used array to string conversion to try and give us an output for that, rather than output the entire array. Now, if we wanted to see the entire array, we can do that. Let's just try this real quick. Echo, let's look at the array itself. See what that gives us? That comes back and gives us array as well. Instead, it's really helpful when you're working with arrays to use print underscore R. That stands for print readable. And that's a nice way for debugging to see what's inside of our arrays. Now, it's not something we would ever want to show to our users. It's really just for our purposes. With our array, hopefully, we've pulled the data out of the array that we want, and we're not going to run into this problem. But let's just do print R on mixed and see what that gives us back. You see, that gives us something that's readable now. It shows us, this is an array, and here's what that array contains. And you can see the indexes in front of each one. This is index 0, this is index 1, and so on. Even nicer is if you put the pre-tags around it for the HTML. And now, look at that. Now they're indented and everything. Makes it nice and easy for us to follow and see what's inside that array. Now, what if we wanted to get a value out of this array, right? So we're basically looking inside one array, and then from that, pulling another value out of that array. We can do that. Let's just go up here and copy this line. We'll bring it down here. And after we get back the nested array, which is in position 3, then we're just going to ask for what's in position 1 right after it. Square bracket followed by square bracket. Go take a look. There it is. It returned Y to us. See how that works? Now I'm just going to get rid of these warnings up here by just commenting these lines out so we don't hit those anymore. Now, what about adding things to our array, right? We were able to pull things out of the array, but we want to be able to assign values into it. We don't want to have to redefine the whole array each time. We can put things into pockets by simply saying mixed, and we'll say at position 2 equals cat. That's it. That's all there is to it. We just say, all right, at position 2, set this value. Put that in there. It's just the simple assignment operator. Let's do another one. I'll just copy this line. And let's say that at position 4, we're going to put mouse. Now, wait a minute. There is no position 4. Position 3 was this item here. So position 4, it's okay to refer to it. It's going to put an item in that 4th position for us. So let's go ahead and take a look. And while we're at it, let's move our print the array down to the bottom. And that will allow us to just see everything that's in there. So here it is. See cat up here and mouse down here in the 4th position. There's also another way. If you don't know how long something is and you just want it to go to the end, you can just make it be blank. Let's do horse. And that will put it at the end. It's appending it to the end. Whatever the last index is, this is going to add it to the end of it. Take a look at that. And so there it is. I put horse in the 5th position. So the power of arrays is that a set of information can be referenced by a single variable. Imagine if we have 1,000 email addresses. We wouldn't want to create 1,000 variables for those. Instead, we can assign all of them to an array, and that they keep their information in the same order unless we change it. Whatever we put in the first pocket stays in the first pocket. So arrays are good for keeping ordered lists. We can sort those 1,000 email addresses, and then they'll be kept in that order for us by the array. You can imagine how arrays are going to start helping us when we start pulling records and data out of our database. We can retrieve 50 customer records, sorted alphabetically by last name, and store them in the array. And they'll stay sorted in that array by last name. The one last thing that I want to mention to you is that PHP 5.4, which most of you are probably running, 5.4 or later, has a short array syntax. Instead of writing out the word array, we can just use square brackets to define it. So an array can be equal to square bracket 1, 2, 3, square bracket. This doesn't work in 5.3 or earlier. So because of that, I'm going to stick with the long notation so that anyone taking this training who happens to be using an earlier version won't get stuck. But if I were writing PHP for myself, well, I would definitely use this shorter notation. So it's up to you which one you want to use. Array with the parentheses around it is probably going to start becoming rarer over time, but right now this square bracket is a little bit new, so you aren't going to see it in a lot of older code, especially if they still need to support older versions of PHP. But you should be able to see it in both forms, and PHP has another type of array called an associative array. And it's important for us to learn how to use both types and to understand the difference between them. An associative array is an object-indexed collection of objects. Now that's very similar to what we saw for the definition of a regular array, but notice that it doesn't say that it's ordered anymore, and instead of being integer indexed, it is object indexed. That is, they're going to be indexed by a label of some sort. Let's remember the expanding file folder metaphor that I gave you when we were talking about arrays. Associative arrays are similar, but they work more like hanging file folders. They're not in any certain order, and they can be rearranged. Each of those file folders is going to have a label on it, and that's how we're going to find information. Since we won't know what order the information is in, instead we will thumb through those file folders until we find the label that matches what we're looking for. Instead of saying, our phone bill is in pocket 1 and our electric bill is in pocket 2, instead we'll say, find the pocket labeled phone bill and pull out its contents. We call the label on each of these pockets the key, and the contents of what's inside the pocket the value. And the combination of the label and the value is referred to as the key-value pair. So we'll always have a series of keys and values that make up our associative array. Both an array and associative array have their uses. When the order matters to us, we want to use an array. When the order is not important, and we want to have the convenience of having a label that we can refer to, well then we want to use an associative array. So if we have 100 customers, we would want to store them in an array. The order of those customers is what matters. But then the information about each customer, I would want to store in an associative array. I don't care that the first item in the array is their first name. In fact, I don't want to have to remember the order in which the data is stored. Instead, I want to be able to ask the array, give me back the information that's labeled first name, and retrieve the data that I'm looking for. So both of them are going to have their place. Let's try one out. So for associative arrays, let's start by opening up basic.html, and we'll do save as, and we'll call this Assoc underscore arrays. Assoc is what I'm going to use for short for association. And make sure you put .php at the end. And here, associative arrays. All right. Now the function that we're going to use to create these is going to be exactly the same as what we had for a regular array. We're just going to use array with the parentheses around it. That is an empty associative array as well as it is a regular array. There's really not a big difference. What matters though is what we put inside of it. So if, for example, inside this array I put first name as a label, that's a string, an object, it's object indexed, and I point that, and I do that using the equal sign and the greater than sign. So it looks like an arrow pointing to the next data, which is the value. So the key is first name, the value is Kevin. And we can have more than one of those. We can have comma, and then last name, again, the arrow pointing to Skoglund. And you can put your own name in there instead of mine. And there we go. That is what an associative array looks like. Instead of being indexed by the position, it's going to be indexed by the key. So if I wanted to get back the first name, echo, then I would do it by saying variable assoc, square bracket still asking for the value using square brackets, and now I need to put the index in here. It's still an index. Before it was an index that was a position, now it's an index that's an object, and the object is the string first name. Has to match exactly because that's the label. I'm looking for first name with that exact capitalization with the underscore in between them. Let's just put a BR tag at the end of that. And let's bring that up in a browser. Instead of just arrays, let's put a sock underscore in front of it. And there we go. It brought back the first name for us. It looked it up in our array based on its label. That's what it was indexed by. And of course, if we wanted to bring up both first name and last name, we know how to do that using append. I'll put a space, and then I'll just copy this, paste it here, turn this into last name. Bring that up, and you'll see that it brings back both values. Now, assignment works the exact same way that it did when we were working with regular arrays. We have a sock, and then first name equals Larry. That's going to assign Larry to the thing that's labeled, that's indexed by first name. And then let's just echo it again so we can see the results. You can see now it's changed it, and the value is equal to Larry in there. Now numbers don't work anymore. So for example, if we were to come down here and we were to ask it for what is in position 0, and let's bring that up. You see it comes back and says, oops, undefined offset, right? Basically, I don't have an index called 0. I'm looking for 0 and I don't see it there. So that's not going to work. That is, unless you indexed it by using numbers, right? Any object can be there. It doesn't have to be a string. We could use a number. So in fact, what you'll realize is that this array that we had, numbers, 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42, is exactly the same as if we had this associative array written out. 0 points to 4, 1 points to 8, and so on. It's the exact same thing. Let's just bring that up in the browser, and you can see that it brought up 4 for us. It returned this value because it's indexed with this. So in fact, there's not a lot of difference between an array and an associative array, except that we have the convenience of not putting each one of those numbers in there when we're just concerned about the order. So you can see that in fact, an array and associative array actually have a lot in common. They're really built the same way inside PHP. It's just that when we write it in this form, we aren't providing the indexes. We're assuming that it can be derived from the position of the items. Whereas here, we're actually specifying what each one is. And if we wanted to make this one into 20, that's perfectly valid. We can do that. We can say that the index of it would be 20. It's not 2 anymore, it's 20. So arrays are going to play a big part in programming, so it's important that you make sure that you understand them. If this didn't make sense at first, then watch these 2 movies again and make sure that you have a good they are and how they work before we move on. After that, some functions that work on arrays. In this movie, I want us to talk about array functions. And there are a lot of functions for working with arrays because arrays are super useful and we're going to use them in a lot of different contexts. And there's lots of things that we might want to do with them and ways we want to manipulate that information. So we're going to look at a few of the most common ones, and then I'm going to show you how you can look up the rest of them. To start with, let's create ourselves a new file for this. And let's make our basic.html file saved as, we'll call this array functions.php. There we go. Inside sandbox, array functions. So to start with, I'm going to paste in a numbers array last 2 videos. But the difference is that I've jumbled them all around. They're not in the same order anymore. And that's because one of the things that we're going to be looking at is how we can sort those numbers. But before we do that, I want to look at a couple of other ones. The simplest one, of course, is just that we can count those values. We can use count to tell us how many items are in the array. What's the size? What are the number of items that it contains? There's max, which will tell us the maximum value, and min to tell us the minimum value. That's very handy, especially if we're working with math, and we want to make sure that we take something that's always the maximum of several choices or the minimum of several choices. Let's bring those up in a browser and take a look. Let's save that and go back to Firefox. And instead of associative arrays, we're now going to be looking at array functions. So 6 values in there. The maximum value is 42. The minimum value is 4. As I said, we can also sort those values. Just make my window a little bigger here. So I'm going to sort them. And then right after I sort them, I'm going to use print r to output it so that we can see the result. So sort and then output it. And then r sort is for reverse sort, and we'll output the result of that. Take a look at what each of those give us. So reload this page. So sort and then reverse sort. If you'd like, you can put PRE tags around those to make it easier to read. Let's do that real quick. There we go. You can see that sort returned them in ascending order, whereas reverse sort returned them in descending order by value. Now there are rules if these aren't numbers as to how they get sorted. Obviously, if you were sorting a bunch of strings, it would sort them alphabetically by the first letter and then the second letter and so on. If you were sorting an array that had a mixture of things, it would sort them for you, but the sort order might not be what you'd expect because whether it sorts a letter before a number or a number before a letter is a little bit arbitrary, and you'd have to look that up in PHP to see which one it was going to do. So you typically wouldn't do it in that case, but it would go ahead and handle it for you, which is that it actually sorted the array in place. We didn't do any kind of assignment. We didn't have to say numbers equals a sorted version of that, right? It changed it in place. It's a destructive function. So our old version, our old unsorted version, doesn't exist anymore, right? It sorted them in place. Another handy function is how we can turn an array into a string. In other words, combine values together to get a string. And we can do that with implode. So what we do is we say what array we want is the second argument. The first argument is what the separator is between each of those elements. So here I've said it's a space and an asterisk and a space. I'll save that and you'll see what it looks like. Let's just do an echo on that so that we can see it. And you'll see that it imploded it. Now it's 42 star 23 star 16 star, right? It's not an array anymore. This is a string. We could do get type on that and we would see that it was a string now. The opposite of implode is explode. So explode is going to take a string like numString, and every time that it finds this string, it's going to use it as a divider between the values. So every time it sees space asterisk space, it's going to say, all right, that's where I need to split this into a new object in the array. So we can see what it does here. Let's come back, return, and you can see that here's the array. It divided it back up into each of the values. It took this string and said, all right, 42 is the first value. This is a separator. 23 is the next value. This is a separator, and so on. This is extremely useful when you're working with something like a comma separated list, right? So you have first name, comma, last name, comma, address, comma, city, comma, state, comma, zip, that sort of thing. Well, you can break that up into an array by telling it to explode it based on where the commas are. Another useful thing to be able to do is to be able to tell whether or not something is in an array or not. Does an array contain a value? So 15 in an array, echo, does the array contain the number 15 inside numbers? And it's going to return true or false. Is 19 in the array? And it's going to return either true or false for whether 19 is inside the array numbers. So in_array is what allows us to do that. Let's save that, try that out. So 15 in an array? Yes, it is. True is represented by 1 here. 19 in an array? No, false. False is represented by having nothing there. Now, as I said, there are many, many functions for working with arrays. If you go to the php.net website, so php.net/manual and then your language, list of them. You can see I could just scroll down the list here. There are a few that I think are especially interesting. There's array keys that returns just another array of only the keys from an associative array. And then there's the same thing for array values down here. Returns just the values. So if you have a key value pairs, you can just grab all the keys out of it or all the values out of it. Array push is an interesting one. That allows you to push an element onto the end of an array. Array pop does the opposite. It takes an element off the end of the array. Array shift is what you would use to put an element onto the front of an array. An array unshift is what you would use to take it off of the